Imagine waking up to the sound of gulls and the scent of salt air, only to end the day with your village in flames and your neighbors screaming as longships slide ashore like knives through butter. This is not a fantasy. This is what it was really like to face a Viking raid. If you enjoy listening to history that doesn't sugarcoat the past, subscribe now, because we're about to dive into 2 hours of raw, recorded reality. The calm before the storm was deceptively gentle. Life in a coastal village, whether nestled along the English shore, tucked into an Irish inlet, or perched on the Frankish coast, was a rhythm of survival, community, and mild discomfort. These settlements were small, often no more than a few dozen timber, framed homes with thatched roofs that leaked when it rained and smoked when it didn't. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool, fish guts, and whatever the pigs had decided to roll in that morning. Children ran barefoot through mud and manure, chasing chickens that were smarter than they looked. Dogs barked at nothing. Old women muttered prayers to saints whose names they barely remembered. And somewhere, someone was always complaining about the weather. Villagers lived close to the land and closer to each other. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the dead. If you had a secret, you kept it buried under the floorboards with last year's salted herring. The church bell rang for mass, for births, for deaths, and occasionally for when someone's goat got loose and started terrorizing the altar. Religion was omnipresent, but not always comforting. The priest was often the only literate person in town, which made him both revered and resented, especially when he reminded everyone that sin was everywhere and God was watching, even when you were just trying to relieve yourself behind the granary. Farming, fishing, and trading were the lifeblood of coastal medieval communities. Simple, repetitive, and absolutely essential. The fields were a patchwork of barley, rye, and oats, tilled by men with backs bent like question marks and hoes that had seen more seasons than they had teeth. Ploughing was done with oxen, unless you were poor, in which case you were the ox. Fertilizer came from whatever the animals left behind, and crop rotation was less a science and more a desperate attempt to not starve. Fishing was no less brutal. Men rose before dawn, their boats little more than floating splinters, and cast nets into waters that were either generous or cruel, depending on the mood of the tide. Cod, herring, and mackerel were staples, though occasionally something monstrous would surface, an eel the size of a child or a fish with too many eyes. And the villagers would whisper about omens and saints. Nets tore, boats leaked, and fingers froze, but the sea was a fickle god, and you prayed it was in a giving mood. Trading was a chaotic ballot of barter and suspicion. Markets were held weekly, sometimes in muddy clearings, sometimes in churchyards, where pigs wandered freely and children tried to steal apples with the subtlety of drunken squirrels. Goods were exchanged with grunts and gestures. Grain for salt, fish for cloth, eggs for iron nails. Coins were rare, and trust rarer. Foreign merchants arrived with strange accents and stranger wearers' spices that burned the tongue, fabrics that shimmered like water, and stories that made the local priest twitch. Occasionally, a ship would dock carrying goods from far off lands. Frankish wine, Irish linen, or English wool, and the villagers would gather like moths to a flame, wide-eyed and suspicious. Deals were struck, curses muttered, and someone inevitably tried to pay with a chicken that wasn't theirs. Trade was survival, but it was also theatre, and everyone played their part. And amid this earthy chaos, rising above the fields and fishmongers, stood the village church, modest, weather-worn, and crowned with a small silver cross that caught the morning light like a whispered promise. Inside, monks hunched over parchment, copying manuscripts with aching fingers and quiet devotion, preserving the words of saints and scholars, while the world outside prepared for storms of steel and fire. Evening in the village was a symphony of chewing, slurping, and passive-aggressive grunting. Families gathered around smoky hearths, seated on stools that wobbled like theological arguments, to share meals that were more functional than flavorful. The staple: dark bread. Dense, chewy, and capable of doubling as a weapon in a tavern brawl. It was made from rye or barley, depending on what hadn't been stolen by crows or cursed by the neighbor's goat. The crust was hard enough to chip a tooth, and the inside was moist enough to remind you of the damp socks you forgot by the fire. Alongside this culinary brick came salted fish, preserved with enough sodium to embalm a bishop. Cod, herring, or whatever had been dragged from the sea and hadn't screamed too loudly. The fish was dried, salted, and hung from rafters like aquatic laundry. It was tough, pungent, and required the jaw strength of a bear to chew. Children gnawed on it like teething rings. Elders sucked on it like spiritual lozenges. Occasionally, someone would try to soften it by boiling it in ale, which only made it taste like regret. Meals were communal, loud, and vaguely competitive. Everyone had a story to tell, usually involving a pig, a priest, or a mysterious rash. The father would grumble about the weather. The mother would mutter about the neighbors' suspiciously fertile chickens. And the children would argue over who got the fish tail, which was either a delicacy or a punishment, depending on the family. The dog, if present, would stare at the salted fish with the haunted eyes of someone who had tasted it once and vowed never again. Conversation was lively, if not entirely coherent. Topics ranged from crop yields to which saint was best at curing boils. Occasionally, someone would mention the Norsemen, strange, pale men from across the sea who sailed in dragon-headed boats and allegedly drank from skulls. But these were just stories, surely, tales told by drunk merchants and monks with too much ink, and not enough sleep. The idea that men could cross the sea, land without warning, and burn everything to the ground was ridiculous. Probably French propaganda. Most villagers dismissed the rumors. Norsemen. Bah, just wind and waves playing tricks on sailors. They'd say, chewing on fish jerky that tasted like salted despair. Besides, if they were real, God would protect us, or at least the bishop would scream loud enough to give us time to run. And so, the warnings were ignored. The stories were laughed off. The silver cross atop the church gleamed in the fading light, and the monks inside kept copying manuscripts, blissfully unaware that soon, very soon, they'd be running for their lives with ink, stained robes, and half-finished psalms. Because the Norsemen were real, and they were coming. It began with the fog. Thick, damp, and clinging to everything like a drunk uncle at a wedding. The morning mist rolled in from the sea, swallowing the coastline in a blanket of pale silence. The villagers, still groggy from dreams of salted fish and passive, aggressive saints, stirred in their homes. A few early risers were already out, grumbling about the cold, poking at reluctant cows, and wondering if the fog meant rain or just another excuse to avoid ploughing. The sea, usually a companion, now looked ominous. Grey as old bones, it stretched out like a warning, its surface rippling, with a wind that carried no scent, no sound. Just a chill that made even the bravest farmer clutch his wool tunic a little tighter. Birds stopped singing. Dogs stopped barking. Even the pigs, usually the loudest philosophers in the village, fell silent. Then someone saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a shape in the mist, long, low, and gliding across the water like a ghost with somewhere to be. Then another, and another. The fog parted like curtains at a very unfortunate play, revealing longships, sleek, fast, and utterly terrifying. Their hulls cut through the waves with the grace of predators. Their sails, blood red or raven black, billowed like war banners. And at the prow of each ship, carved in wood and painted with menace, were dragon heads, snarling, leering, and looking like they'd just eaten a bishop for breakfast. The ships didn't bob or sway like normal boats. They slithered, as if the sea itself was helping them arrive faster. No creaking, no shouting, just the rhythmic slap of oars and the occasional glint of sunlight off a helmet that looked suspiciously like it had been stolen from a monastery. The villagers squinted, blinked, whispered. Are those merchants? No merchant sails with a dragon's face, and a crew that looks like they wrestle bears for fun. Maybe they're pilgrims. Pilgrims don't carry axes the size of small children. Maybe they're lost. Then God help whoever gives them directions. As the ships drew closer, the details sharpened. Men with braided hair, cloaked in furs and iron, stood at the rails. Their eyes scanned the shore like wolves choosing which sheep to eat first. Shields lined the sides of the ships, painted with symbols that looked like angry runes or very aggressive soup recipes. One man, clearly the leader, stood beneath a banner depicting a raven eating a crown. He smiled. It was not a comforting smile. And then the horns blew. Low, deep, and vibrating through the earth like a burp from the underworld. The sound rolled over the village, shaking windows, rattling chickens, and causing one elderly man to drop his prayer beads and mutter something about finally meeting St. Peter with a black eye. The villagers froze. Then someone dropped a basket. Then someone screamed. Then everyone ran. It was chaos. Beautiful, ridiculous pants, wetting chaos. The moment the first villager dropped a basket of turnips, it was as if someone had shouted, "The Norsemen are giving out free ale!" Except instead of running toward the beach, everyone bolted in the opposite direction, like their feet had suddenly remembered they were overdue for a pilgrimage. Turnips rolled across the dirt like tiny, confused witnesses. Chickens exploded into flight. One man tripped over his own dog and screamed something about St. Cuthbert, abandoning him in his hour of need. Children shrieked and sprinted in every direction, some toward their homes, others toward the woods, and one particularly ambitious lad straight into the church, where he tried to hide behind a statue of St. Jerome and was promptly scolded by a monk mid-psalm. Women grabbed their babies, their baskets, and occasionally someone else's baby by mistake. Old men hobbled as fast as their knees would allow, muttering curses about those bloody boat demons. And why didn't anyone listen to Ethel when she said the sea looked angry? The village bell rang furiously, though no one was quite sure who was ringing it. It might have been the priest. It might have been a goat. At that point, it didn't matter. The sound was enough to send the remaining villagers into a frenzy of flailing limbs and panicked prayers. One man tried to climb a tree and got stuck halfway, dangling like a confused squirrel. Another attempted to hide in a barrel of pickled herring, which was both brave and deeply unfortunate. The pigs, sensing the mood, joined in. They squealed and stampeded through the village, knocking over carts, and one particularly unlucky monk, who had just finished illuminating a manuscript and now found himself illuminated by mud and panic. A cow broke loose and ran straight into the church, where it stood in the nave like a bovine prophet, mooing with the solemnity of someone who had seen the future and did not approve. Meanwhile, the village's self-declared watchman, a man named Osric, who once claimed to have fought off a wolf with a spoon, stood frozen at the edge of the beach, mouth agape, clutching a pitchfork like it was a holy relic. "They've got helmets," he whispered, as if that alone was a war crime. And beards, big ones. Behind him, the longships grew larger, closer, more terrifying. The carved dragon heads leered at the shore, their wooden eyes gleaming with the promise of pillage. The sea churned beneath them, not with waves, but with purpose. And then, as if the gods themselves had decided to add a soundtrack to the impending doom, the horns blew. Low, deep, and ancient. The sound rolled across the waves like thunder wrapped in menace. It was followed by the rhythmic pounding of war drums, echoing across the water. Each beat a promise of fire, steel, and very bad news. The villagers had heard drums before, during festivals, weddings, and that one time Osric tried to summon rain with a bucket and a stick. But these were different. These drums didn't invite dancing. They didn't celebrate harvest. They didn't ask politely. They announced. Each beat was a declaration: we are coming. We are armed. We are not here to negotiate. The sound seemed to rise from the sea itself, as if the ocean had grown tired of being ignored and decided to send a musical warning. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly confident. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. It knew exactly what it was doing. Children clung to their mothers. Dogs whimpered and crawled under carts. The priest, who had spent the last decade preaching about divine mercy, suddenly remembered a few verses about divine wrath and began reciting them with the urgency of a man who had just realized his sermon notes were written in Latin and his audience spoke mostly pig. A fog, once a gentle veil, now felt like a curtain pulled back for a performance no one wanted to see. The longships loomed larger, their dragon heads grinning with wooden malice. The warriors aboard them stood still, like statues carved from iron and bad intentions. Their shields gleamed, their helmets caught the light, and their eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, scanned the shore with the precision of men who had done this before. Many times. The war drums continued, each beat a countdown. Boom, boom, boom. Somewhere, a monk dropped his quill and whispered, "We should have copied faster." And then, as if the sea itself exhaled, the longships reached the shallows. The warriors moved. With a sudden, terrifying grace, the Vikings leapt into the surf, axes and shields ready. It was like watching a nightmare do gymnastics. One moment, the longships were gliding silently through the shallows, and the next, splash! Dozens of heavily armed men were bounding into the water, like angry seals with commitment issues. The surf churned around them, but they didn't stumble, didn't hesitate. They moved with the confidence of men who had done this before, many times. Possibly last Tuesday. Their boots hit the sand with a squelch that sounded suspiciously like doom. The villagers, still mid-sprint, turned just long enough to see the first wave of Norsemen charging up the beach like a very well-organized stampede. These were not the confused, sick pirates of local rumor. These were professionals. Their axes gleamed. Their shields were raised. Their beards were majestic and terrifying, like angry squirrels nesting in iron helmets. One Viking, particularly enthusiastic, let out a war cry that sounded like someone gargling gravel while reciting poetry. Another tripped over a crab, recovered instantly, and proceeded to chase a fleeing farmer with the kind of energy usually reserved for tax collectors. The leader, taller than the rest, with a fur cloak that screamed, "I wrestled this bear myself," strode forward with the calm menace of someone who knew exactly how many chickens he was about to steal. The villagers, meanwhile, were in full panic mode. One man tried to hide behind a wheelbarrow. Another attempted to bribe a Viking with a turnip. A third simply lay down in the mud and began reciting every prayer he'd ever heard, including one that was definitely just the lyrics to a drinking song. The priest ran in circles, waving a candle and shouting, "Sanctuary," at a cow. The Vikings didn't care. They were here for loot, glory, and possibly the thrill of terrifying people who wore shoes made of bark. They advanced with the precision of a marching band. If that band was armed to the teeth and had a deep hatred of monasteries. Their shields formed a wall, their axes swung with practiced ease, and their expressions ranged from mildly amused to delighted to be ruining your day. And what a sight they were! Leather, iron, fur, and painted shields. The Vikings didn't just arrive. They announced themselves with fashion choices that screamed, "We're here to ruin your day," and look good doing it. Their armor was a patchwork of practicality and intimidation. Leather tunics, hardened by years of wear and the occasional bloodstain, clung to their frames like second skin. Over that, iron mail glinted in the morning light, each ring a testament to someone's bad day in a previous village. Some wore fur cloaks, Not for warmth, but for drama, because nothing says, "I'm about to sack your church," like a bear pelt flapping in the wind. Their shields were round, sturdy, and painted with symbols that ranged from terrifying to mildly confusing. Spirals, ravens, wolves, and runes that looked like angry stick figures danced across the wood. One shield bore what appeared to be a smiling eel, which may have been a family crest or just a Viking with a questionable sense of humor. The colors were bold: reds, blacks, yellows, designed to catch the eye and possibly distract you long enough for an axe to find your spleen. Helmets varied. Some were simple iron caps, dented and practical. Others had nose guards, cheek plates, and the occasional decorative flourish that suggested the wearer had strong opinions about personal branding. Contrary to popular myth, no horns. Those were a later invention by artists who clearly never had to run in one. Real Viking helmets were built for battle, not cosplay. Their boots were thick, their belts heavy with knives, and their expression somewhere between "I'm here for loot" and "I hope someone resists so I can test this new axe." They moved with purpose, not the clumsy swagger of drunk raiders, but the disciplined stride of seasoned warriors. These were men who had crossed seas, fought kings, and probably wrestled a walrus or two for fun. And then they began to shout, shouting in Norse war cries. It was not polite shouting. It was not, "Excuse me, we're here to pillage," shouting. It was full-throated, lung-rattling. Goose summoning battle howling that made the birds flee. The cows reconsider their life choices, and one elderly villager drop his bread and whisper, "Well, that's me done." The Vikings didn't just yell, they declared war with their vocal cords. It was a chorus of rage, pride, and possibly indigestion. Some shouted actual words in Old Norse, which to the villagers sounded like someone angrily reciting a recipe for fermented shark. Others just roared. Deep, guttural sounds that vibrated through the soil and made the church windows tremble. One particularly enthusiastic warrior screamed so loudly his helmet fell off, and he didn't even notice. These weren't random noises. Viking war cries were strategic psychological warfare. They were meant to terrify, to intimidate, and to make you question every life decision that led you to live near a beach. The leader's cry was like thunder wrapped in fury. Others followed suit, creating a wall of sound so intense it could probably curdle milk. Somewhere, a monk fainted just from the acoustics. Some Vikings shouted their own names, daring anyone to remember them. Others shouted the names of their gods: Odin, Thor, Freyja, as if invoking divine backup for what was about to be a very one-sided argument. One man screamed, "Jorn," so passionately that 3 villagers assumed Jorn was the name of the axe. And the rhythm of it. Oh, the rhythm. It wasn't just noise. It was orchestration. Horns blew in between the shouts, war drums pounded like angry thunderclouds, and the warriors stomped through the surf with the coordination of a very violent dance troupe. It was terrifying. It was theatrical. It was Viking Broadway, and the opening number was called "Your Village is About to On Fire." The villagers, meanwhile, were not prepared for this musical. They had rehearsed no lines, had no costumes, and their choreography mostly involved tripping over baskets and screaming. The priest tried to shout back in Latin, but it came out as a panicked squeak that even the chickens ignored. And so, as the Norsemen roared and the drums thundered, the villagers did the only logical thing. They tried to hide. Priests rang bells, not for mass, but as a desperate alarm. The bells were supposed to be sacred. They were meant to call the faithful to prayer, to mark the passing of saints' days, to toll gently for the dead. But on this morning, they rang like panic incarnate, a clanging, frantic, metallic scream that echoed off the stone walls and bounced through the village like a divine tantrum. The priest, normally a man of solemn dignity and questionable hygiene, had abandoned all liturgical grace and was now yanking the bell rope with desperation. The bell tower itself seemed confused. It had never been asked to scream before. It groaned under the strain, the rope fraying, the clapper slamming against the bronze sides with such force that pigeons exploded from the rafters in a flurry of feathers. An existential dread. The sound was deafening, relentless, and deeply unholy in its urgency. Villagers who had been hiding behind barrels, under carts, or inside haystacks popped their heads out like terrified prairie dogs. The bell was supposed to mean safety. It was supposed to mean sanctuary. But today, it meant run faster. It meant they're here. It meant your prayers better be prepared. Inside the church, chaos reigned. Monks scrambled to gather manuscripts, some clutching illuminated pages like they were life vests on a sinking ship. One tried to stuff an entire psalter into his robe, only to trip and land face, first in a basket of communion wafers. Another attempted to hide behind a statue of Saint Michael, which promptly tipped over and crushed the baptismal font. The altar boy, who had never been trained for Viking protocol, stood frozen with a censer in one hand and a loaf of sacramental bread in the other, unsure whether to swing or snack. The priest kept ringing. His face was red, his arms trembling, his cassock flapping like a terrified flag. He shouted Latin phrases between pulls, most of which were either misquoted scripture or panicked improvisations. "Domen salvum fac nos!" he cried. "Please don't let them burn the wine cellar." Outside, the villagers were in full retreat. Some ran toward the woods, others toward the hills, and a few just ran in circles, convinced that, if they moved fast enough, the Vikings wouldn't be able to catch them. One man tried to disguise himself as a bush. Another attempted to bribe a passing pig for safe passage. A woman threw her shoe at a longship, which did absolutely nothing, except make the Vikings laugh. And still the bell rang. It rang as the first Viking reached the edge of the village. It rang as the warriors began to spread out, shields raised, eyes scanning for anything worth looting or setting on fire. It rang as the leader stepped forward, his axe gleaming, his expression somewhere between amusement and hunger. And then, as the bell gave one final, exhausted clang, the village fell silent. All that remained was the smell. The smell of salt, sweat, fear. It was a pungent cocktail of terror and poor hygiene. The salt came from the sea, the sweat from the villagers, and the fear. Well, that was everywhere. It clung to the air like a damp blanket, heavy and sour, the kind of smell that made you question your life choices and whether bathing once a month was truly enough. The Vikings smelled like adventure and armpits. Their arrival had stirred up the beach, the livestock, and the collective bowels of the population. The surf reeked of churned algae and panic. The villagers, having sprinted, screamed, and in some cases soiled themselves, now crouched behind barrels, haystacks, and one very confused cow, breathing heavily and regretting every decision that had led them to live within rowing distance of Scandinavia. The priest, still clutching the bell rope, like it owed him money, had finally collapsed in a heap, wheezing Latin curses and smelling like incense. Desperation, and a faint hint of sacramental wine. The monks were huddled in the corner of the church, clutching manuscripts and muttering prayers that sounded suspiciously like shopping lists. One had tried to hide behind a tapestry of St. Cuthbert, only to discover it was embroidered on linen and offered zero protection against axes. Children whimpered. Dogs whimpered. One pig whimpered, then remembered it was a pig and resumed rooting through someone's abandoned lunch. The village was a mosaic of fear and body odor, punctuated by the occasional scream and the distant sound of a Viking sharpening something ominous. And the Vikings. They were loving it. They stood on the beach like gods of chaos, sniffing the air like wine connoisseurs. One turned to another and said something in Norse that probably translated to, "Smells like fear," and fish stew. "Let's get started." Another adjusted his fur cloak, cracked his knuckles, and grinned like a man who who just found out the monastery had a wine cellar and no guards. Then, with the precision of a butcher dividing a particularly unlucky cow, the raiders began to split into groups. The attack begins. Vikings splitting into groups, some to the church, some to houses. It was like watching a pack of wolves decide which part of the flock to eat first. The Vikings didn't charge blindly. They organized, which was somehow more terrifying. One group, led by a warrior with a helmet dented in a way that suggested he'd headbutted a horse at some point, made straight for the church. They knew what they were after: silver, relics, manuscripts, and monks who screamed in Latin. The church was the village's spiritual heart, but to the Norsemen, it was a treasure chest wrapped in guilt and incense. The monks inside had already barricaded the doors with pews, hymnals, and one very confused altar boy. They clutched their manuscripts like life rafts, whispering prayers and occasionally arguing over which saint was best at repelling axe, wielding pagans. Outside, the Vikings approached with the calm menace of men who had sacked holier places than this. One knocked politely, then kicked the door so hard it echoed like a thunderclap. The monks screamed. The altar boy fainted. The door cracked. Meanwhile, the second group of Vikings fanned out into the village proper, their boots squelching through mud and panic. They moved with purpose, scanning for anything that looked valuable, flammable, or edible. One warrior paused to sniff a loaf of bread before tossing it aside in favor of a jug of ale. Another kicked over a barrel, found a chicken, and chased it with the enthusiasm of a man who hadn't had poultry in weeks. They didn't just loot, they evaluated. They poked at baskets, lifted lids, sniffed cheeses, and occasionally shouted in Norse at confused villagers who were trying to hide behind their own children. One Viking found a stash of turnips and looked genuinely offended. Another discovered a stash of coins hidden under a mattress and let out a triumphant yell that sounded like someone gargling victory. The leader of the house looting squad, broad, bearded, and wearing a cloak that looked suspiciously like it used to be a bear, pointed at the nearest cottage. His men nodded. They approached with the confidence of men who had kicked in more doors than they could count. And then, with a grunt and a boot, kicking in doors, grabbing valuables. They kicked in doors like they were auditioning for a Viking version of home renovation. Except instead of improving property value, they were subtracting it with axes. The first door went down with a splintering crash, followed by a cheer from the warrior, who clearly considered carpentry destruction a personal hobby. Inside, a family screamed and scattered like startled pigeons. The Viking stepped over a broken stool, sniffed the air, and immediately began grabbing anything that looked remotely valuable: a silver spoon, a carved bowl, a tapestry depicting Saint Olaf looking mildly constipated. They didn't loot with subtlety. They looted like toddlers in a candy shop, loud, enthusiastic, and with zero regard for organization. One Viking found a chest of coins and dumped it into his fur-lined satchel with the glee of a man who just won a very aggressive game of bingo. Another discovered a stash of dried apples and began eating them mid-raid, pausing only to shout something in Norse that probably translated to, "These taste like sadness, but I'm hungry." Doors were kicked in with such frequency that the village began to resemble a collection of open-air huts. Hinges flew. Wood cracked. One Viking kicked a door so hard it ricocheted off a wall and hit his comrade, who responded by laughing and stealing the injured man's helmet. They were efficient, brutal, and weirdly cheerful, like a band of marauding uncles who'd had too much mead and decided to redecorate with fire. Valuables were grabbed indiscriminately. Jewelry, coins, goblets, livestock, and one confused cat were all swept into sacks. A warrior held up a carved wooden duck and shouted triumphantly, as if he'd found the Holy Grail. Another tried to loot a barrel of pickled fish, only to gag and kick it over in disgust. The church's wine cellar was discovered, and suddenly half the raiders were drunk, singing Norse ballads and trying to ride a goat like a warhorse. But not everyone fled, not everyone hid. Some villagers resisted. And that's when the Vikings began slashing and beating resistors. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't strategic. It was pure, chaotic, axe-swinging mayhem. The kind of violence that made you question whether your village's defense plan, consisting mostly of pitchforks and prayer, had ever stood a chance. The few brave souls who dared to resist were met with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for tavern brawls and competitive log tossing. Osric, the self-proclaimed village watchman, was the first to try. Armed with a pitchfork and a speech he'd clearly rehearsed in front of a mirror, he stood his ground and shouted, "You shall not pass!" which was both dramatic and wildly ineffective. A Viking looked at him, blinked, and then swatted the pitchfork aside like it was a mildly annoying fly. Osric screamed, dropped his dignity, and ran straight into a chicken coop, where he remained for the rest of the raid, covered in feathers and existential regret. Another villager, a blacksmith named Wulfgar, attempted to defend his forge with a hammer the size of a small child and the confidence of a man who'd once wrestled a goat. He managed to dent a shield and insult someone's mother in Old English before being but firmly tossed into a barrel of ale. He stayed there, sipping quietly, until the Vikings left. The priest tried to intervene with holy water and a stern lecture about eternal damnation. The Vikings, unimpressed, took the holy water, drank it, and used the empty flask to store stolen honey. One warrior patted the priest on the head before stealing his sandals, which he wore for the rest of the raid while shouting, "I am the bishop now." Children threw rocks. Women threw insults. One elderly woman threw a cabbage with such force it knocked a helmet off. The Viking who lost his helmet applauded her aim, then stole her goat. The resistance was brave, yes, but also deeply uncoordinated. It was like watching a group of squirrels try to fight a bear. The Vikings didn't just overpower, they outperformed. They dodged, they parried, they laughed. One even juggled apples mid-battle, just to show off. And as the last brave villager was gently deposited into a haystack, the real chaos began. Livestock scattered, hooves thundering, feathers flying, and fires started, small at first, then roaring, as thatched roofs caught flame and the village began to glow with the warm, flickering light of total disaster. It was pandemonium with a soundtrack of squeals, clucks, and the occasional Viking laughter echoing like thunder from a very smug sky. Chickens launched themselves into the air like feathered missiles, flapping in every direction except the one that made sense. Pigs squealed and sprinted, their stubby legs working overtime as they zigzagged through burning haystacks and overturned carts. One particularly ambitious goat climbed onto a roof, just in time for it to catch fire, then leapt off like a flaming prophet, landing in a barrel of ale and emerging drunk and mildly singed. The fires began innocently enough, just a torch tossed onto a pile of straw, a spark from a knocked-over lantern, a Viking who thought, "This looks flammable," and wanted to test his theory. But thatched roofs are not known for their fire resistance. Within minutes, the village looked less like a settlement and more like a poorly planned bonfire festival. Smoke billowed into the sky, thick and black, curling like the devil's own signature. Villagers screamed and ran, some trying to save their homes with buckets of water, others just trying to save their socks. One man attempted to beat out a fire with a broom, only to set the broom ablaze and then chase himself in circles. Another tried to reason with the flames, shouting, "Not the pantry," as if fire respected emotional pleas. A woman threw a pie at a Viking, missed, and hit a cow, which then panicked and ran straight through a fence, taking half the barn with it. The Vikings, meanwhile, were having the time of their lives. They looted, they burned, they occasionally paused to admire their handiwork. One warrior roasted a stolen chicken over a burning cart while humming a Norse lullaby. Another used a flaming pitchfork to toast bread, proving that even in chaos, breakfast matters. The leader stood atop a barrel, arms raised, basking in the glow of destruction like a man who'd just won a very violent lottery. And through it all, the livestock continued their stampede. Horses galloped through alleyways, ducks waddled into the church, and a sheep somehow ended up wearing a monk's robe and standing in the pulpit, bleating with what could only be described as divine confusion. But the worst was yet to come, because as the flames licked higher and the smoke thickened, the Vikings turned their eyes to the one building still standing proud, still untouched by fire, still ringing its bell in desperate defiance. The church. And inside, monks were trying to hide relics, whispering prayers, and hoping that divine intervention came with a sword. The monks moved quickly but quietly, their sandaled feet scuffing against the stone floor, as they gathered sacred relics. Bones of saints, fragments of holy cloth, silver chalices, and illuminated manuscripts painstakingly copied over decades. These were not just objects. They were the spiritual lifeblood of the monastery, believed to hold divine power, protection, and memory. Now, they were being hidden in crypts, behind altar stones, beneath floorboards, anywhere that might escape the eyes of the raiders. Some monks whispered prayers, their voices trembling, Latin syllables falling like fragile shields against the storm outside. Others wept silently, clutching crucifixes and relic cases to their chests. A few knelt before the altar, heads bowed, lips moving in desperate invocation. They prayed not for vengeance, but for mercy, for the strength to endure, for the salvation of their brothers, for the hope that God might intervene with sword or miracle. The abbot, older than most, stood near the sanctuary, his face pale but resolute. He had seen raids before, though never like this. He directed the younger monks with quiet urgency, guiding them to hide the most precious items in the sacristy and beneath the choir stalls. He knew the Vikings would come. He knew they would not respect the sanctity of the place. But he also knew that some things must be preserved, even if the walls fell. Outside, the bell had stopped ringing. The smoke from the village fires curled past the stained glass, casting flickering shadows across the nave. The sound of boots on gravel grew louder. The church doors, thick, wooden, iron-bound, shuddered under the weight of approaching footsteps. And then, with a splintering crack, the Vikings began breaking open the wooden doors. The church had stood for generations, its thick oak doors bound with iron and blessed with prayers meant to keep evil at bay. But prayers were no match for axes. The first blow landed with a thud that echoed through the nave like a funeral drum. The second split the wood. The third sent the doors flying inward, revealing the flickering candlelight and terrified faces within. The monks had done what they could. They had stacked pews, dragged stone fonts, and wedged hymnals into the cracks. But the raiders were relentless. The moment the doors gave way, the Vikings surged forward, boots pounding on flagstones, shields raised, eyes scanning for anything of value. The sanctity of the space meant nothing. This was not a house of God to them. It was a vault. The abbot stood firm for a moment, arms outstretched, invoking divine protection. A Viking shoved him aside, not cruelly, but with the indifference of a man moving furniture. The monks scattered, some clutching relics, others diving behind altars or into side chapels. One tried to hide beneath the car stalls, whispering psalms as if each verse might turn him invisible. The raiders moved quickly. They knew what they were looking for. Silver crosses, polished and ornate, were ripped from the altar. Chalices, heavy with craftsmanship and centuries of reverence, were emptied and stuffed into sacks. Manuscripts, bound in leather and illuminated with gold leaf, were torn from shelves and tossed into crates. Some Vikings paused to admire the artistry. Others simply saw weight and worth. The church, once a place of quiet devotion, now echoed with the sounds of looting, metal clinking, parchment tearing, footsteps thudding. The sacred became spoils. The holy became currency. And the monks, powerless to stop it, could only watch as their world was dismantled piece by piece. The nave, once filled with whispered prayers and the soft rustle of robes, now rang with the harsh scrape of boots and the guttural bark of foreign tongues. Candles flickered in the smoky air, casting trembling shadows across the stone walls, illuminating the chaos in flashes like a grim strobe. The altar, once the center of spiritual life, was stripped bare, its cloth torn, its relics seized, its sanctity shattered. Manuscripts, some copied over decades, others inherited from generations past, were ripped from shelves and chests. Illuminated pages fluttered to the ground like wounded birds, their gold leaf glinting briefly before being crushed underfoot. The Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, the Psalters and Missals, works of devotion and artistry, were reduced to plunder, their theological weight measured only in the value of their bindings. The sacristy was breached, chalices, censers, reliquaries, objects that had touched the divine, were scooped into sacks with the same indifference as grain. A Viking held up a silver cross, admired its craftsmanship, then tossed it to a comrade like a trinket. Another pried a reliquary containing the bones of a saint, sniffed and shrugged. To them, it was just old ivory. To the monks, it was a catastrophe. The choir stalls were overturned. The baptismal font was cracked. The stained glass shattered inward, raining coloured shards onto the stone floor. A statue of the Virgin Mary was knocked from its pedestal, her face breaking cleanly in two. The incense that still hung in the air mingled with the stench of sweat and smoke, creating a perfume of desecration. Some monks tried to resist, not with weapons, but with pleas. They begged for mercy, offered gold, pointed to the crucifix as if it might intervene. But the Vikings were unmoved. They had come for wealth, and they would take it. One monk clung to a manuscript, refusing to let go even as he was dragged across the floor. Another tried to hide a chalice beneath his robe, only to be struck down with the flat of a blade. The abbot, who had stood firm at altar, was knocked aside. His voice, once steady, now trembled as he recited the Psalms. "Deliver us, O Lord, from the hand of the wicked." But the wicked were already inside, and they were not listening. And then the violence turned personal. Some monks were killed, their bodies left crumpled beside the altar or sprawled across the cloisters. Others were taken as slaves, bound and dragged from the sanctuary, their futures erased in a moment of conquest. The violence inside the church was swift, brutal, and without mercy. The sanctity of the space offered no protection. The altar, once a place of peace and communion, became a backdrop for bloodshed. Some monks, refusing to abandon their posts or relics, were struck down where they stood, crumpled beside the altar, their robes soaked in blood, their hands still clutching crucifixes or manuscripts. Others were cornered in the cloisters, trying to flee through narrow passageways, only to be cut down by blades that did not distinguish between soldier and supplicant. The cloisters, once echoing with chants and quiet footsteps, now bore the silence of death. Bodies lay sprawled across the stone, limbs twisted, faces frozen in expressions of terror or prayer. The scent of incense was replaced by iron and ash. The flickering candlelight danced across the walls, casting long shadows that seemed to mourn the fallen. Not all were killed. Some were taken, bound with coarse rope, dragged from the sanctuary like spoils of war. These were men who had devoted their lives to silence, contemplation, and service. Now they were commodities, destined for slave markets in foreign lands, their vows and identities erased in a moment of conquest. Their futures were no longer their own. They would serve not God, but masters who spoke a language they did not understand, in lands they had never imagined. The abbot, wounded but alive, was among those taken. His eyes, once filled with quiet wisdom, now stared blankly ahead as he was pulled from the church he had tended for decades. A younger monk, barely more than a novice, sobbed as he was forced to leave behind the reliquary he had guarded with trembling hands. Another, too old to walk, was left behind, his fate uncertain, his prayers unanswered. Outside, the village burned. The sky was thick with smoke. The sea, indifferent, lapped at the shore, and from the tower above the church, the bell, once a call to worship, a signal of hope, rang out one final time. Bells ringing, then silenced. The fires were not subtle. They started as flickers, tiny, curious flames licking at the edges of hay bales, and thatch like toddlers testing boundaries. But thatch, as it turns out, is nature's version of kindling. Once lit, it goes up faster than a monk's temper during Lent. One roof caught, then another, and soon the village looked less like a settlement and more like a poorly planned Viking-themed barbecue. Houses burned with theatrical flair. The flames danced, twirled, and occasionally exploded in ways that made even the Vikings pause and admire their handiwork. One warrior toasted a stolen loaf of bread over a burning doorway while humming a Norse lullaby. Another tried to roast a turnip, failed, and threw it at a fleeing pig. The pig did not appreciate this. Thatch roofs collapsed like soggy pancakes, sending sparks into the air and occasionally dropping flaming bundles onto unsuspecting livestock. A chicken, previously minding its own business, found itself launched skyward by a collapsing roof and landed in a barrel of ale, emerging drunk and mildly offended. A goat ran through 3 burning houses, emerged singed but triumphant, and promptly headbutted a Viking in the shin. Villagers, meanwhile, were in full panic mode. One man tried to beat out a fire with a broom, only to set the broom ablaze and then chase himself in circles. Another attempted to reason with the flames, shouting, "Not the pantry," as if fire respected emotional pleas. A woman threw a pie at a Viking, missed, and hit a cow, which then panicked and ran straight through a fence, taking half the barn with it. The air was thick with smoke, ash, and the unmistakable scent of roasted despair. Windows shattered, beams groaned. A statue of St. Cuthbert melted slightly, giving him a look of mild disapproval. The village bell, which had been ringing in defiance, finally gave up and fell from its tower with a clang that sounded suspiciously like, "I told you so." And as the sun rose over the horizon, casting golden light on the smouldering ruins, the scene settled into a grim tableau, smoke in the morning air, screams mixing with crackling flames. It was the kind of morning that made you wish you'd stayed in bed, or at least hadn't built your house out of glorified hay. The smoke curled through the village like a nosy ant, poking into every corner, every chimney, every unfortunate hiding spot. It smelled of burning wood, panic, and the unmistakable scent of someone's stew that had been left on the fire a little too long. Somewhere, a loaf of bread was still baking, now infused with the essence of catastrophe. The flames crackled with enthusiasm, leaping from rooftop to rooftop like gossip at a feast. Thatched roofs collapsed in dramatic fashion, sending sparks skyward and occasionally dropping flaming bundles onto unsuspecting livestock. One chicken, having had enough of this nonsense, launched itself into the air and flew straight into a Viking's helmet, where it remained, clucking indignantly. The Viking, to his credit, wore it like a crown. Screams echoed through the haze, some from villagers, some from pigs, and one from a man who had just realized he'd left his pants behind. The soundscape was a symphony of chaos, crackling fire, clanging swords, bleating sheep, and the occasional monk yelling, "Not the manuscripts," as he tried to rescue a scroll from a puddle of ale. Visibility was poor. People ran into fences, carts, and each other. One man tried to flee with a wheelbarrow full of turnips, only to trip and scatter them like confetti. Another attempted to carry his grandmother, his dog, and a barrel of pickled fish all at once, and ended up dropping the fish. The dog, and his dignity. The grandmother kept walking. And then came the truly unfortunate ones. The fleeing villagers with nothing, clutching whatever they could, a spoon, a shoe, a half-eaten onion. Some tripped over debris, over livestock, over their own feet. And when they fell, the Vikings were there, grinning, grabbing, dragging them back like over-enthusiastic party hosts who refused to let anyone leave early. It was the kind of exodus that would make even the most hardened chronicler pause mid, quill and mutter. Well, that escalated. These were not warriors. These were not heroes. These were people who had woken up expecting porridge, and now found themselves sprinting through smoke with a turnip in one hand and existential dread in the other. One man ran with a spoon clutched like a dagger, eyes wide, muttering, "Saint Thord, protect me," as if the spoon had divine powers. Another woman clutched a shoe, not hers, not her child's, just a shoe she'd found in the chaos, and decided it might be useful for bartering or throwing. A child held a half-eaten onion, gnawing it like a survival snack, tears streaming down his face from both fear and flavor. They tripped over everything, fallen beams, broken carts, startled pigs and each other. One elderly man tried to leap over a barrel, failed spectacularly, and rolled into a pile of hay, where he lay groaning and quoting scripture. A young couple attempted to flee hand in hand, only to be separated by a stampeding goat that had clearly had enough of everyone's nonsense. And when they fell, the Vikings were there, grinning, grabbing, dragging them back like over-enthusiastic party hosts who refused to let anyone leave early. "Where are you going?" Their expressions seemed to say. "The fun's just begun." One Viking scooped up a fleeing farmer, like a sack of potatoes, and tossed him over his shoulder with the ease of a man who regularly lifts livestock for sport. Another chased down a woman who had tried to hide behind a bush, only to discover it was actually a Viking helmet, with leaves on it. Some villagers tried to play dead. Others tried to play dumb. One tried to play the lute, hoping music might soothe the savages. It did not. The Vikings were not interested in lullabies. They were interested in loot, laughter, and the kind of chaos that made bards weep with gratitude. And so, as the sun rose higher and the fires crackled merrily, the raiders began to laugh, deep, hearty, unbothered laughter that echoed through the village like thunder, with a sense of humor. They slapped each other on the back, pointed at the fleeing villagers, and began gathering loot with the enthusiasm of children in a candy shop where everything was free and mildly flammable. They weren't just looting, they were celebrating. Celebrating the chaos, the flames, the sheer absurdity of how easy it had all been. One Viking, still wearing a chicken on his helmet from earlier, danced a little jig atop a broken cart while waving a stolen ladle like a scepter. Another had fashioned a necklace from spoons and was now declaring himself king of the kitchen. A third was trying to teach a pig to sit while simultaneously stuffing his sack with candlesticks and someone's wedding goblet. They slapped each other on the back with the camaraderie of men who had just ruined someone's week and were proud of it. They pointed at villagers still trying to flee, chuckling as one tripped over a barrel and another ran straight into a fence. One warrior held up a tapestry depicting Saint Cuthbert and asked if it would look good in his longhouse. His comrade replied, "Only if you hang it next to the goat's skull." And they both laughed like they'd just heard the best joke in Scandinavia. Loot was everywhere. Jewelry, coins, goblets, tools, livestock, and one very confused monk's sandal. They stuffed it all into sacks, crates, and occasionally their own pockets. One Viking tried to carry a barrel of ale and a sack of onions at the same time, tripped, and rolled down a hill, emerging victorious and slightly pickled. And then came the real treasure hunt. The raiders began to search under floorboards, prying up planks with daggers and axes, sniffing out the hidden stashes of coins, trinkets, and emergency turnips. One warrior found a pouch of silver buried beneath a bed and shouted victory, before realizing it was actually filled with buttons. Another uncovered a stash of gold coins tucked beneath a hearthstone and declared it the best breakfast surprise ever. The plundering had entered its final, greedy phase. No cupboard was safe, no cellar untouched, no floorboard left unlifted, because beneath the soot and screams, the Vikings knew. The real wealth was always hidden, and they were determined to find it, even if it meant turning every cottage into a crime scene and every pantry into a treasure hunt. One Viking pried up a floorboard and found a mouldy turnip, which he held aloft like a sacred relic before tossing it at a chicken. Another discovered a stash of coins hidden inside a hollowed-out loaf of bread and declared it the tastiest bank I've ever robbed. They opened cupboards with the subtlety of drunken bears. Doors flew off hinges. Shelves collapsed, and one Viking got stuck inside a wardrobe for 10 minutes before emerging with a fur coat and a smug grin. Cellars were raided with gusto. Barrels were rolled, wine was sampled second and spilled, and one warrior fell down a ladder, landed in a pile of onions, and decided to stay there until someone looted him. The search was thorough. Beds were flipped. Mattresses were stabbed. One Viking found a stash of coins hidden inside a stuffed goose and spent the next hour trying to convince his comrades it was a magical bird that laid silver. Another raider, convinced that treasure was buried beneath the outhouse, began digging furiously, only to discover that some secrets are best left undisturbed. And just when the villagers thought it couldn't get worse, the Vikings turned their attention to personal adornments. They began ripping jewelry from necks, chains, pendants, lockets, and anything that glittered, regardless of sentimental value or whether it had just been blessed by a monk 5 minutes earlier. It was a glittery frenzy. The Vikings moved through the village like magpies with muscle, eyes locked on anything that sparkled. Necklaces were yanked mid-scream, rings twisted off fingers with the delicacy of a bear performing surgery, and brooches were pried from cloaks with the enthusiasm of toddlers unwrapping presents. One warrior held up a locket, opened it, saw a tiny portrait inside, shrugged, and pocketed it anyway. Sentimentality was not part of the Viking code. Villagers clutched their heirlooms like lifelines, only to have them snatched away with a grunt and a grin. A woman tried to hide her gold chain under her collar, only to have the collar removed entirely. A man attempted to swallow his silver pendant, but a Viking with a very creative sense of dental hygiene retrieved it with a spoon and a laugh. One monk clung to a reliquary necklace, whispering prayers until a raider gently removed it and said something in Norse that probably meant, "Thanks, I'll give it to my wife." The raiders didn't discriminate. If it glittered, it was gone. If it jingled, it was looted. If it looked vaguely valuable, it was now Viking property. Even fake jewelry wasn't safe. One warrior took a tin brooch shaped like a duck and wore it proudly, declaring it a symbol of conquest. Another found a necklace made of dried beans and decided it was exotic. And once the jewelry was stripped, the Vikings turned their attention to the rest, taking weapons, clothes, tools. The Vikings were now in full scavenger mode, and nothing was safe, not even your grandma's knitting needles. They swept through homes like a very aggressive spring cleaning crew, grabbing weapons, clothes, and tools with the enthusiasm of bargain hunters at a medieval yard sale. Axes, taken. Swords, taken. That rusty pitchfork you swore was just for hay, taken and now being wielded by a Viking who thinks it's a ceremonial trident. One warrior found a butter knife and declared it perfect for close combat, while another took a ladle and began swinging it like a mace, shouting something in Norse that probably meant, "Fear the soup." Clothes were snatched with zero regard for fashion or fit. Tunics, cloaks, boots, and even undergarments were fair game. One Viking tried on a pair of woolen trousers 3 sizes too small and strutted around, like he was debuting a new line at Viking Fashion Week. Another found a bonnet, wore it proudly, and insisted it made him look mysterious. The villagers watched in horror as their wardrobes were dismantled and repurposed into Viking cosplay. Tools were looted with equal gusto. Hammers, saws, chisels, and one very confused spinning wheel were hauled away like prized relics. A Viking held up a rake and declared it a multi-pronged battle device. Another found a bucket and wore it as a helmet until someone pointed out it still had goat milk in it. He didn't care. He said it added character. Even the mundane wasn't spared. A spoon was taken and immediately used to flick pebbles at chickens. A broom was claimed as a witch fighting staff. One Viking took a pair of tongs and began clapping them menacingly at villagers who weren't sure whether to laugh or run. And just when the villagers thought they'd seen the worst of Viking creativity, the raiders turned their attention to the real treasure, finding food stores, barrels of oil. The Vikings had already looted the valuables, stripped the jewelry, and turned every cupboard into a crime scene. Now came the part they truly relished, the feast phase. They descended upon the village's food stores like hungry bears at a picnic, except these bears were armed, slightly drunk, and had very strong opinions about cheese. They kicked open pantry doors with the same enthusiasm they'd shown for church relics. Barrels of oil were discovered and immediately tapped, some with proper tools, others with axes, and one with a Viking who simply bit the lid off. The oil flowed freely, sloshing into mugs, helmets, and one unfortunate monk's shoe. A warrior toasted the burning village, took a swig, and declared it bit smoky but bold. Cheese wheels were hoisted like trophies. Salted meats were devoured mid-loot. One Viking found a smoked ham, hugged it, and refused to share. Another discovered a stash of dried apples and began juggling them while singing a song that sounded suspiciously like a threat. Bread loaves were tossed around like footballs. A particularly large Viking used one as a pillow and promptly fell asleep next to a burning fence. The food stores were raided with the precision of a culinary invasion. Pickled fish, onions, grain sacks, and honey jars were all claimed. One warrior tried to eat raw flour, sneezed violently, and blamed the devil. Another found a barrel labeled, "Do not touch," and took it as a personal challenge. It turned out to be filled with fermented cabbage. He ate it anyway. And then came the barrels of ale. Glorious, frothy, and entirely unguarded. The Vikings rolled them out into the open, cracked them open with glee, and began pouring drinks for each other, like it was a wedding reception hosted by chaos. One barrel was turned into a hot tub. Another was used as a drum. A third was simply hugged for 20 minutes. But as the feast raged and the fires crackled, the mood shifted. The laughter dulled. The looting slowed. And the Vikings turned their attention to the strong young men and women. Those who had not fled. Those who had not resisted. Those who were now chained and pushed toward the shore. The mood shifted like a sudden storm. Gone was the raucous joy of pillage and plunder. Now came the grim efficiency of human cargo collection. The warriors moved with purpose, their eyes scanning for youth, strength, and silence. They didn't want the elderly, the sick, or the loud. They wanted bodies that could row, build, carry, and obey. Ropes were brought out. Thick, coarse, and already stained from previous raids. The chosen were bound at the wrists, some at the ankles, and herded like livestock toward the beach. A few tried to resist, but resistance now was met not with laughter, but with a swift blow or a barked command. One young man lunged for his sister, only to be knocked to the ground and dragged by his hair. A girl tried to run, but her foot caught on a broken beam, and she was scooped up like a sack of grain. They were lined up in rows, heads down, shoulders hunched. Some stared blankly ahead, others wept quietly. A few whispered prayers, though whether to God or to the sea was unclear. The Vikings didn't speak to them. They didn't threaten or taunt. They simply moved them forward, toward the longships, toward the unknown, toward a life that would no longer be theirs. And behind them, the village watched. Children cried, their small voices piercing through the smoke. Parents begged, falling to their knees, clutching at cloaks, offering coins, relics, anything to keep their sons and daughters from being taken. But the Vikings did not barter. They did not pause. They did not care. The chains clinked. The surf hissed. And the cries of the innocent rose like incense into a sky that had already turned its face away. It was dramatic. It was tragic. It was also somehow awkwardly theatrical, like a village-wide performance of Les Miserables, directed by a Viking with a flair for the dramatic. The surf hissed not with menace, but with the passive-aggressive tone of someone who'd been left out of the looting. The chains clinked in rhythm, almost musical, as if the longships had hired a percussion section. And the cries. Oh, the cries! They ranged from operatic wails to high, pitched squeaks, with one child sobbing so rhythmically that a Viking started tapping his foot. The villagers being herded toward the ships looked like a parade of regret. Some shuffled with heads down, others glanced back longingly at their burning homes, and one man tried to escape by pretending to be a bush. He was betrayed by a sneeze. Another woman clutched a loaf of bread like it was a passport to freedom. A Viking took the bread and gave her a turnip. It was not a fair trade. The longships bobbed in the shallows like hungry ducks, waiting to be fed a fresh batch of unwilling passengers. The warriors stood beside them, arms crossed, expressions somewhere between. We've done this before. And I hope someone tries to act so I can stretch my legs. One Viking was already carving tally marks into his shield, presumably counting how many villagers he'd personally terrified. A monk tried to bless the sea. The sea ignored him. A child asked if the Vikings were taking them on a holiday. His mother said yes, then immediately regretted it when the child asked if there would be snacks. One man tried to bribe a Viking with a potato. The Viking took the potato, bit it raw, and nodded approvingly. And as the villagers were loaded onto the ships, chained, confused, and clutching whatever dignity they had left, the mood shifted again. It wasn't just the chains. It wasn't just the smoke. It was the fear of being taken across the sea, never returning. And not just any sea. The kind of sea that looked like it had opinions. It churned ominously, slapped the shore with passive-aggressive waves, and smelled faintly of fish and regret. The longships bobbed in the surf like giant wooden crocodiles, their dragon heads grinning as if they knew something you didn't. Which they did, namely, that you were about to become a very unwilling passenger. The villagers stared at the horizon like it was the final boss in a game they hadn't trained for. The idea of being whisked away to some distant fjord where the weather was colder, the vowels were longer, and the food involved a suspicious amount of pickled things was not appealing. One man whispered, "I don't even like boats," before being nudged forward by a Viking who clearly did. Some tried to stall. One woman claimed she had to feed her cat. Another insisted she was allergic to salt water. A third began reciting her family tree in hopes it would bore the Vikings into letting her go. It did not. The warriors simply nodded politely, then handed her a sack of stolen spoons and pointed to the ship. The fear wasn't just about leaving, it was about never coming back, about becoming a footnote in someone else's saga, about being renamed John's third favorite slave, and spending your days hauling barrels and your nights wondering if that goat was judging you. One villager asked if they'd be allowed to write letters. The Viking said yes, then handed him a rock and walked away. And just when the villagers thought things couldn't get more humiliating, they were forced to carry stolen goods to the ships. It was the final insult in a long list of indignities. Not only had the villagers been raided, looted, and emotionally scarred by a Viking wearing a bonnet and juggling onions, they now had to help load the loot, It was like being mugged, and then asked to hold the thief's shopping bags. The procession to the shore looked like a very confused parade. Villagers trudged forward, arms full of stolen candlesticks, barrels of pickled despair, and one very judgmental goose. A man carried a tapestry that had hung in his family's home for 3 generations. A Viking walked beside him, humming and occasionally poking the man with a spoon to keep the pace brisk. One woman was tasked with hauling a barrel of ale, so large it could have doubled as a Viking jacuzzi. She rolled it slowly, muttering curses in 3 languages, while a warrior behind her offered helpful advice. Like, try using your knees. And don't spill it. We're thirsty. Another villager carried a sack of spoons, which jingled with every step like a very sad tambourine. Children were made to carry smaller items, goblets, coins, a suspiciously heavy cheese wheel. One boy tried to eat the cheese mid-march and was rewarded with a Viking pat on the head and a second cheese wheel. It was unclear whether this was encouragement or punishment. The Vikings supervised with the smug satisfaction of men who had outsourced their pillaging logistics. They pointed, they barked orders, and occasionally they helped, usually by lifting something heavy and then immediately dropping it on someone's foot. One warrior insisted on organizing the loot by color. Another tried to ride a barrel down the hill to the ship, fell off, and declared it a strategic maneuver. And so the villagers marched, burdened by the very treasures that had once defined their homes, now destined to decorate longhouses in lands they'd never see. The beach became a loading dock of misery and mild slapstick, with Vikings shouting things like, "Careful with the relics," and "That's not yours anymore. But carry it like it is." The longships loomed ahead, dragon-headed and smug, ready to swallow the spoils of conquest. The departure had begun, Vikings loading stolen goods and captives onto ships. The beach had transformed into a chaotic Viking version of a loading dock. Longships bobbed in the shallows like smug crocodiles, their dragon-headed prows grinning at the carnage behind them. Warriors barked orders. Villagers stumbled under sacks of stolen goods, and the surf hissed as if trying to wash away the evidence. Loot was everywhere. Barrels of ale rolled down the sand. Goblets clinked in crates. And one Viking was trying to balance a tapestry, a goat, and a barrel of pickled fish on his shoulders, like a very aggressive street performer. Another had fashioned a necklace from stolen spoons and was now declaring himself lord of utensils. No one challenged him. The captives were herded aboard with all the grace of reluctant luggage. Chained and grim-faced, they were nudged up gangplanks by warriors who had clearly missed their calling as disgruntled cruise directors. One Viking tried to organize them by height. Another insisted on assigning seating arrangements based on who looked most likely to cry. A monk was dragged aboard clutching a manuscript, still reciting psalms. A farmer was forced to carry a barrel of turnips he no longer owned. A child asked if the ship had snacks. The Viking said yes, then handed him a dried fish and winked. The warriors worked with the efficiency of men who had done this before, many times. They packed the ships like seasoned movers, stacking crates, tying down livestock, and occasionally arguing over whether a stolen statue of Saint Cuthbert should go near the ale or the onions. One Viking tried to fit a spinning wheel into a corner, failed, and threw it overboard with a shrug. And just when it seemed the ships were nearly full, and the last reluctant villager had been nudged aboard, the Vikings turned back toward the village one final time, setting additional fires before leaving. Because apparently, pillaging wasn't enough. They wanted to leave a Yelp review in flames. The Vikings, already loaded with loot, captives, and a goat wearing someone's wedding veil, turned back toward the village, with one final mission maximum. Dramatic exit. They didn't just want to leave. They wanted to leave with flair. And what better way to say, "We were here," than by setting additional fires in places that hadn't even been looted yet. One warrior lit a haystack just because it looked at him funny. Another set fire to a barrel of turnips, declaring it culinary protest. A third tried to ignite a puddle, failed, and then set fire to a scarecrow instead, which promptly exploded in a cloud of straw and regret. They weren't strategic. They were artistic. Flames were placed like brushstrokes. On rooftops. In wells. Inside someone's soup pot. One Viking arranged firewood in the shape of a rune before lighting it, then stood back and admired his work like a pyromaniac Picasso. Another tried to set fire to a wheelbarrow, only to discover it was already on fire. He congratulated himself anyway. The village, already resembling a medieval disaster zone, now looked like it had been rejected by the gods. Smoke curled into the sky like a sarcastic question mark. Chickens ran in circles, pigs rolled in ash, and one cow stood in the middle of the square, chewing calmly as everything burned around it. The cow had seen things. A monk tried to extinguish a fire with holy water. It hissed, flared up, and singed his eyebrows. He declared it a sign, and sat down to reevaluate his life. A child asked if this was part of a festival. His mother said yes, then cried into a loaf of bread. And just when the chaos reached its peak, when the last cottage had been flambéed, the final barrel had been flamboyantly kicked into a bonfire, and the goat had finally stopped screaming, the Vikings turned toward the sea. They climbed aboard their longships, loot stacked high, captives chained, and one warrior still wearing a bonnet and juggling onions. And then, with the kind of theatrical timing that would make a bard weep, horns blew again as the ships pulled away. And not just any horns. Dramatic, echoing, Viking horns. The kind that sound like someone yelling into a barrel while standing on a mountain. They blared across the water like a farewell concert performed by angry walruses. The longships, dragon-headed and smug, bobbed in the surf like they'd just won a very messy talent show. The Vikings stood proudly aboard, waving stolen spoons, wearing mismatched cloaks, and shouting things in Norse that probably translated to, "We'll miss your Al, and tell Saint Cuthbert we said he." One warrior blew his horn so enthusiastically he fell overboard, was fished out by a goat, and resumed blowing as if nothing had happened. The ships pulled away with theatrical flair. Oars dipped in perfect rhythm. Sails billowed dramatically, and one Viking tried to steer with a ladle. The captives sat in silence, chained and confused, while the lute clinked and clattered around them like a very judgmental orchestra. A barrel of onions rolled across the deck. A pig squealed in protest. A monk whispered psalms to a chicken. On shore, the remaining Vikings lit one last bonfire, because why not? And tossed in a wheelbarrow, a tapestry, and what might have been someone's laundry. The flames roared, the smoke curled, and the beach smelled like roasted regret. And then, as the horns gave one final, triumphant blast, the ships turned toward the horizon, leaving behind a village that looked like it had hosted a party thrown by arsonists with a flair for interior design. Silence settled, and from the ashes, survivors began crawling from hiding, blinking at the daylight, weeping over burned homes, scorched turnips, and the general absurdity of what had just happened. It was like the village had hosted a surprise party for disaster, and everyone had RSVP'd. Oh no? People emerged from barrels, haystacks, root cellars, and one very confused chicken coop, blinking like they'd just been born into a world where everything smelled like smoke and disappointment. One man crawled out from under a cart, looked around at the smouldering ruins, and muttered, "Well, that escalated." The survivors were a mosaic of soot and disbelief. A woman stumbled out of a well, clutching a ladle and a half-eaten onion, unsure whether she'd been hiding or just really committed to soup. A child emerged from a pile of laundry, wearing 3 tunics and a boot on his head, declaring himself king of the ashes. No one argued. They wandered through the wreckage like tourists in a museum curated by chaos. One man tried to salvage a scorched turnip, cradling it like a newborn and whispering, "You're still beautiful to me." Another picked up a melted spoon and held it aloft like Excalibur, only to drop it when it burned his hand. A monk emerged from behind a statue missing its head and declared, "I think we won," before promptly fainting. The village square was a surreal landscape of half-burned carts, collapsed roofs, and livestock that had clearly seen too much. A goat stood atop a pile of rubble, chewing on a tapestry, and staring into the middle distance like a philosopher, contemplating the futility of existence. Chickens strutted around like they owned the place, clucking judgmentally at the humans who had failed to protect their feed. One man tried to sweep the ashes from his doorstep with a broom that was also on fire. Another attempted to rebuild his fence using only optimism and 3 bent nails. A woman sat on a pile of broken pottery, sighing deeply and muttering, "At least the Vikings didn't take my sourdough starter." She was wrong. They had. And as the survivors limped, crawled, and emotionally unraveled their way through the ruins, the laughter of the raiders faded into the horizon, replaced by the soft, grim crunch of footsteps on charred earth. The aftermath had begun. Walking through ashes, finding bodies. It was the kind of morning where even the sun seemed unsure if it should show up. Survivors wandered through the ruins like confused ghosts, stepping over charred beams, collapsed walls, and the occasional Viking souvenir: a spoon, a boot, a goat hoof. The ground was soft with ash, crunching underfoot like stale biscuits, and every step came with the risk of discovering something you didn't want to see or smell. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, some in dramatic poses that suggested they died mid-monologue. Others curled up like they just wanted 5 more minutes of sleep. One unfortunate soul had collapsed face first into a pie, which had somehow survived the fire. The pie was now both a memorial and a snack. A child poked it with a stick and declared it still good. No one argued. The mums were the worst off. Their robes had gone from holy to holy, and their expressions ranged from, "I've seen heaven," to, "I've seen the inside of a Viking's boot." One was still clutching a manuscript, now mostly ash and regret. Another had been flattened beneath a pew, which had collapsed with the precision of divine irony. A third was found in the bell tower, dangling upside down and muttering Latin curses that translated roughly to, "I told you so." Animals wandered through the wreckage, equally traumatized. A pig stood beside a fallen warrior, sniffing him suspiciously. A chicken pen perched atop a scorched barrel, clucking like a judge. A goat chewed on a burnt tapestry and stared into the distance, clearly contemplating the futility of existence. And then there were the villagers, those who had survived by hiding in places no one should ever hide. One man crawled out of a well, covered in soot and existential dread. A woman emerged from a pile of laundry, wearing someone else's tunic and a helmet that had seen better centuries. A child popped out of a barrel, declared himself king of the ashes, and promptly tripped over a melted rake. They walked through the ruins like archaeologists of their own disaster, cataloguing broken dreams and scorched furniture. One man found his wedding goblet fused to a chicken. Another discovered his bed had been used as a Viking trampoline. A woman picked up a melted candlestick and whispered, "It was my favorite," before tossing it into the sea with dramatic flair. And through it all, the air hung heavy with the unmistakable smell of smoke, blood, burnt flesh. It was the kind of smell that made you question your life choices. Like, maybe building a village out of flammable optimism wasn't the best idea. The scent clung to everything. Clothes, hair, goats, and refused to leave, like a bad house aghast with opinions on your cooking. It was part barbecue, part battlefield, and entirely traumatic. Survivors wandered through the haze, noses wrinkled, eyes watering, muttering things like, "Eyes that my cousin," or a roasted turnip. One man tried to sniff out his house, only to find a pile of ash and a spoon. A woman held up a scorched boot and whispered. He always wore this to church, before realizing it wasn't her husband's. It was the goat's. The blood was everywhere, not in dramatic pools, but in smears, splashes, and one very artistic streak across a wall that looked suspiciously like a Viking signature. Burnt flesh added a layer of culinary horror, like someone had tried to roast a ham, and accidentally included the ham's entire extended family. One warrior's footprint was still visible in the soot, next to a melted pie and a very confused chicken. People tried to clean up. One monk waved incense like it owed him money. A child threw flower petals into the air and declared it a funeral. The petals caught fire. A man tried to mop the blood with a hymn book. It didn't work, but he said it felt symbolic. Another attempted to bury a scorched sausage, insisting it had once been his neighbor. And then came the silence. The kind that settles after chaos, when even the chickens stopped clucking and the goats stopped judging. Survivors stood in the ruins, blinking at the sky, wondering if it was over or just the intermission. And slowly, grimly, they began the next task, counting the dead, missing. It was less of a census and more of a scavenger hunt, hosted by despair. Survivors wandered through the ruins with soot, streaked faces, and the emotional stability of a damp biscuit, clutching bits of parchment and muttering names like they were casting spells. Ethorid. Oswin. The guy who always smelled like onions. No answer. Just the wind, a goat chewing on a burnt hymn book, and the occasional groan from Sullen who'd fallen into a well. The counting was not organized. It was not dignified. It was mostly people pointing at piles of ash and saying, "I think that was Uncle Thorn," or a wheelbarrow. One woman insisted her husband had turned into a pile of soot shaped like a duck. No one had the heart to argue. A monk tried to tally the dead using a rosary, but kept losing count every time a chicken screamed. Some villagers tried to be methodical. They made lists. They checked under pews, behind barrels, inside what used to be the bakery, but was now a smouldering hole filled with regret and half a pie. One man found a boot and declared this was Joffrey's. He always wore boots. Someone pointed out that everyone wore boots. He nodded solemnly and added, possibly Joffrey, to the list. The missing were harder. They weren't dead. They weren't alive. They were just missing. Possibly taken. Possibly hiding. Possibly turned into Viking soup. A child asked if his sister had become a cloud. His mother said yes, then cried into a scorched turnip. One man claimed his cousin had been abducted by a particularly judgmental goat. The goat did not deny it. And then came the awkward discoveries. A body half, buried in ash, clutching a spoon. A skeleton wearing a bonnet and holding a goblet. A Viking who had apparently died mid-toast, still smiling, still smug. One monk found a pile of bones and tried to bless them, only to realize they were actually turnips. He blessed them anyway. It felt right. A tally grew. The list of names became a litany of loss, confusion, and questionable handwriting. Possibly Joffrey. Definitely not a duck. Might be a pie. The survivors read the names aloud like a dirge composed by someone who'd never met a happy ending. And as the sun dipped low, and the smoke curled like a sarcastic question mark, a new dread settled over the village. The fear that they will return. It hung over the village like a bad smell, and not just the literal one from burnt turnips and Viking sweat. This was the kind of fear that made people jump at shadows, flinch at seagulls, and eye every passing cloud like it might be hiding a longship. The survivors didn't just rebuild, they paranoia built. Every creak of wood, every gust of wind, every goat bleat was met with a collective gasp and someone whispering, "They're back." One man refused to sleep indoors anymore, claiming roofs were Viking magnets. He built a bed in a tree and now shouted warnings at squirrels. A woman began interrogating chickens, convinced they were Viking spies. The chickens clucked suspiciously. A child refused to eat anything round, because Vikings like round things. His diet now consisted entirely of triangles. The village bell, once used for church services, was now rung every time someone saw a cloud shaped like a dragon. It rang 47 times in one afternoon. The bell ringer developed biceps the size of small pigs, and a twitch that made him shout, "Ein Wassaun?" Every time someone sneezed. People began practicing Viking deterrence. One man painted his house to look like a swamp. Another wore a cloak made of cabbage leaves and claimed it made him invisible. A group of monks started chanting backwards, hoping it would confuse any raiders into thinking they'd already looted the place. It didn't work, but it did make the goats nervous. And then came the Viking drills. Every Tuesday, the villagers would run in circles, scream, hide in barrels, and throw turnips at scarecrows. It was chaos. It was tradition. It was mostly just an excuse to scream without judgment. But fear has a way of becoming architecture. Soon, the villagers weren't just panicking. They were planning. They began sketching, digging, stacking, and muttering things like, "If we build the wall tall enough, maybe they'll think we're giants." One man suggested a moat filled with eels. Another proposed catapults that launched angry chickens. A third simply yelled, "Raelus," and started building with whatever wasn't currently on fire. Thus began the long-term effects. Villages fortifying walls, not just with stone and timber, but with trauma turnips, and the lingering scent of Viking ale. The rebuilding wasn't just structural. It was emotional, culinary, and occasionally nonsensical. Villagers, still twitching at the sound of horns, or the sight of a particularly muscular goose, began constructing walls with the urgency of people who'd seen their laundry stolen by men in fur. These weren't just barriers. They were monuments to paranoia. Stone was hauled from quarries. Timber was chopped with vengeance. One man tried to build a wall entirely out of burnt bread, claiming it was symbolic. Another insisted on embedding spoons into the mortar for Viking confusion. A monk suggested adding Latin inscriptions to ward off evil. The villagers agreed, then wrote "Go away" in very shaky Latin. The walls grew taller, wider, more ridiculous. Some had spikes. Others had moats filled with turnips. One village built a gate that only opened if you answered a riddle about cheese. Another installed a bell that rang every time someone said, "Viking." It rang constantly. Watchtowers popped up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Villagers took shift staring at the horizon, armed with spyglasses, soup ladles, and one very aggressive duck. They reported everything. Clouds shaped like ships, suspicious waves, and once, a particularly shady-looking tree. The tree was chopped down. It was just a tree. Training drills became weekly events. Children practiced hiding in barrels. Adults practiced screaming in harmony. One man taught his goat to bite on command. The goat misunderstood and bit everyone. A woman invented a dance called the defensive shuffle, which involved sidestepping, glaring, and throwing onions. But even with walls, towers, and onion choreography, the fear lingered. Because walls could be climbed, gates could be broken, and Vikings had a habit of showing up like bad weather. Unexpected, loud, and wearing questionable fashion. So the villagers did what desperate people do when they've run out of turnips and optimism. They started paying Danageld, tribute to avoid raids. Because nothing says, "Please don't burn our village again," like handing over a wheelbarrow full of silver and salted meats. The villagers, having realized that walls made of turnips and prayers weren't exactly Viking proof, turned to the medieval equivalent of bribery Danageld, also known as "please, go away money." It began awkwardly. A delegation of suit-covered elders approached the Viking camp with a sack of coins, a goat, and a pie. The Vikings blinked, sniffed the pie, and asked, "Is this a trap?" It wasn't. It was dessert. And a down payment on not being pillaged again. Soon, Danegeld became a regular expense, like rent or emotional trauma. Villages set aside part of their harvest, their silver, and occasionally their dignity to pay off raiders who now showed up with invoices. One Viking handed out a scroll titled Pillage Avoidance, Package Premium Tier, which included no burning, limited screaming, and one complimentary goat massage. The payments grew. What started as a few coins turned into mountains of silver, barrels of ale, and one unfortunate village that had to give up its entire cheese supply. The Vikings didn't even like cheese. They just wanted to see people cry. Kings got involved, taxes were raised. Peasants muttered things like, "I didn't vote for this," and "Why are we paying people not to hurt us?" One monk tried to protest, but was silenced with a spoon. The spoon was symbolic, and slightly bent. The worst part. Paying Danegeld didn't stop the raids. It just made the Vikings punctual. They'd arrive, collect their tribute, compliment the new wall, and occasionally burn a shed, just for tradition. One village tried to pay in poetry. The Vikings burned the poet. And so, year after year, the silver flowed, the goats disappeared, and the villagers lived in a state of financial dread and goat scarcity. Children were born into a world where the sound of horns meant, hide the valuables, and don't make eye contact with the man wearing a necklace of spoons. Some children grew up fearing sails on the horizon, not because they understood war, but because they knew it meant losing their toys, their turnips, and possibly their uncle. It became a generational trauma, wrapped in bedtime stories and turnip shortages. Kids didn't play pirates anymore. They played hide the valuables and pretend to be a barrel. One child refused to go near the beach unless armed with a spoon and a goat. Another developed a phobia of clouds shaped like long ships and had to be calmed with pickled onions and interpretive dance. Parents tried to explain the concept of Vikings gently. They're just very enthusiastic visitors. One mother said, while boarding up the windows and burying the family silver in the compost heap. A father told his son, "If you ever see sails, run, or pretend to be a rock. Rocks don't get looted." The boy spent the next 3 weeks lying in the garden, covered in moss. School lessons changed. Geography was replaced with how to spot a Viking. Art class became draw your escape route. History was just a list of things that used to exist before the last raid. One teacher tried to introduce Norse mythology, but the children screamed every time she said Odin. Even toys weren't safe. Dolls were buried for protection. Wooden swords were confiscated in case they attracted attention. One child tried to build a fortress out of turnips. It collapsed, but the symbolism was strong. Another carved a tiny longship, and then immediately threw it into the river, shouting, "Not today." Thor, and the nightmares. Oh, the nightmares. Children dreamed of sails with teeth, of raiders who stole bedtime stories and replaced them with tax demands. One boy woke up screaming, "They took my blanket and gave me a spoon!" His parents nodded solemnly. It had happened before. But over time, something strange began to happen. The fear didn't just linger. It evolved. It began to mix with stories, with whispers, with the strange magic of memory and myth. The line between history and legend blurred like smoke over a scorched village. And so began the stories of the Norse gods, mixing with local legends. The villagers, still picking turnip ash out of their hair and trying to remember which relatives had been turned into pies, began to whisper. Not just about the raids, but about the raiders. And not just the raiders, but their gods. Because when someone shows up wearing a wolf pelt, swinging a hammer, and shouting in a language that sounds like thunder, having an argument with a glacier, you start to wonder if they're just men, or something more. Soon, tales of Odin and Thor and Loki began to seep into the local folklore like smoke through a cracked window. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, became the mysterious stranger who helped a farmer find his lost goat. Thor was blamed for every thunderstorm, broken cart axle, and suspiciously aggressive sheep. Loki was everywhere. Every prank, every missing spoon. Every goat that escaped its pen was suddenly Loki's doing. Children were told bedtime stories that began with saints and ended with frost giants. One tale involved Saint Cuthbert Arm, wrestling Thor for control of the weather. Another claimed that a local well was blessed by Freyja and cursed by a monk who didn't like ducks. The lines blurred. The gods mingled, and somewhere in the chaos, a new mythology was born, equal parts reverence, confusion, and goat-related incidents. Villagers began carving runes next to crosses. Monks debated theology, with farmers who swore they saw Odin riding a cloud shaped like a turnip. One man built a shrine to both Saint Bridget and Freya, just in case. Another claimed his cow was descended from Sleipnir. The cow disagreed. And so, in the smoky aftermath of raids and rebuilding, the Norse gods didn't just invade the land. They invaded the imagination. They became part of the landscape, the stories, the warnings, and the jokes. They were feared, admired, and occasionally blamed for bad harvests and missing socks. But who were these mysterious figures who brought gods, goats, and goblets into the lives of unsuspecting villagers? Who were the Vikings? Let's unravel the truth: traders, raiders, farmers, and occasionally, very dramatic party crashers. The Vikings weren't just the guys who showed up uninvited, set your house on fire, and left with your silverware and your cousin. They were a multifaceted bunch, equal parts terrifying and surprisingly practical. Think of them as the Swiss Army knife of medieval Scandinavia. They could raid, trade, farm, settle, and occasionally invent new ways to terrify monks. Yes, they were raiders, and they were good at it. They had long ships that sliced through water, like angry butter knives, and they knew how to make an entrance. But they didn't just raid for fun, though they did seem to enjoy it. They raided for silver, slaves, and status. It was like extreme couponing, but with axes. But here's the twist: they were also traders. These same axe-wielding maniacs would sail to Constantinople, unpack their furs and amber, and politely haggle over silk and spices like medieval businessmen with excellent beards. They had trade routes stretching from the Baltic to Baghdad, and they knew how to network, sometimes with swords, sometimes with smilers too. And yes, they were farmers. When they weren't pillaging, they were ploughing. They raised livestock, grew barley, and probably complained about the weather. Their settlements were full of blacksmiths, weavers, and people who just wanted a quiet life without being mistaken for a raider every time they wore a helmet. They were also explorers. Vikings reached Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, centuries before Columbus, and with significantly fewer maps. One Viking probably looked at a frozen wasteland and said, "This'll do," and boom, settlement. But let's not forget their flair for drama. When Vikings crashed a party, they didn't just knock politely. They arrived in long ships carved with dragon heads, blew horns that sounded like angry whales, and made sure everyone knew they were there. They were the kind of guests who drank all your ale, stole your furniture, and left behind a goat wearing your best tunic. So yes, the Vikings were raiders, traders, farmers, and very dramatic party crashers. But beneath the helmets and the havoc, they were also deeply spiritual people with a mythology that shaped every part of their lives. Which brings us to their beliefs in Odin, Thor, and Valhalla. Let's dive into the gods, the glory, and the goat-drawn chariots. The Vikings didn't just believe in gods. They believed in gods with flair. Their pantheon was like a dysfunctional family reunion hosted in a cosmic mead hall. At the top sat Odin, the Allfather, one-eyed and all-knowing, who traded his eyeball for wisdom and spent his days brooding, writing poetry, and occasionally starting wars for fun. He was the god of war, death, poetry, and ravens, basically the Norse version of a moody philosopher with a spear. Then came Thor, Odin's son, and the Viking equivalent of a walking thunderstorm. He wielded Memgelunir, a hammer so powerful it could flatten mountains and tenderize turnips. Thor was the Tector of mankind, the god of strength, and the reason goats had trust issues. Because he rode in a chariot pulled by two them, Tangrisna and Tanginjastur, who he routinely ate and resurrected. It was a rough gig. And of course, there was Valhalla, the Viking afterlife for those who died gloriously in battle. Not peacefully in bed. Not from slipping on a turnip. Only glorious death earned you a seat at Odin's table, where you'd spend eternity drinking mead, fighting daily, and waking up refreshed to do it all again. It was like a warrior's spa retreat, but with more axes and fewer cucumbers. The Norse cosmos was divided into realms like Asgard, home of the gods, Midgard, and Helheim, where the not-so-glorious dead went to sulk. The gods were split into two families, the Aesir, who were all about war and order, Thor, Frigg, and the Vanir, who were more into fertility, nature, and awkward family feuds. Vikings didn't just worship, they lived their myths. They carved runes, made sacrifices, sometimes of livestock, sometimes of enemies, and told tales of gods battling giants, tricking each other, and occasionally turning into animals for reasons best left unexplained. Their religion was a blend of awe, fear, and the kind of storytelling that made you question whether Loki had ever been sober. And speaking of Loki, he was the wild card, the trickster, the god of chaos, mischief, and questionable decisions. If something went wrong, a ship sank, a goat escaped, someone lost a bet, it was probably Loki's fault. And somehow, he was still invited to family dinners. But behind the myths and mead, there was a practical side to Viking belief. Their gods reflected their world harsh, unpredictable, and full of opportunity. Which brings us to the next chapter in their saga: why they raided wealth, power, land. Let's crack open the treasure chest of Viking motivation. The Vikings didn't wake up one morning, stretch their arms, and say, "Let's go traumatize a monastery." Their raids were driven by a potent cocktail of economic hunger, political ambition, and real estate envy, with a splash of divine inspiration and a dash of goat-related chaos. First up, wealth. Scandinavia, in the early medieval period, wasn't exactly overflowing with gold, silk, or anything remotely shiny. The land was rugged, the winters were rude, and the local economy was mostly turnips and existential dread. So when word spread that monasteries in England were filled with gold, silver, and monks who couldn't fight back, the Vikings saw an opportunity. It was like discovering a vending machine that dispensed treasure and didn't require coins. Raiding was fast, profitable, and, let's be honest, kind of thrilling. You sail in, yell dramatically, grab everything that glitters, and sail out before anyone can organize a defense. It was the medieval version of a smash and grab, except with longships and poetry about axes. Then there was power. Viking leaders weren't just after loot, they wanted status. A successful raid meant prestige, followers, and the kind of reputation that made other chieftains jealous. It was a way to climb the social ladder while swinging a sword. Young warriors joined raids not just for the spoils, but for the glory. Die in battle, you might just get a ticket to Valhalla. Survive and return with treasure. You're basically a celebrity with a goat. And let's not forget land. Scandinavia was getting crowded. Too many people, not enough farmland, and way too many fjords. So Vikings looked outward, not just to raid, but to settle. They colonized Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Britain, Ireland, and France. Sometimes they showed up swinging axes. Other times they showed up with contracts and cows. Either way, they weren't leaving. Raiding also had a practical side. It funded expeditions, paid warriors, and kept the economy buzzing. It was a business model with a very aggressive marketing strategy. And while it terrified coastal Europe, it also transformed Viking society. fueling trade, exploration, and the occasional awkward diplomatic dinner. But none of this would have worked without the tools of the trade, which brings us to their craftsmanship, ships, and fighting skills. Let's sail into the world of Viking ingenuity. If the Vikings had LinkedIn profiles, their top skills would be shipbuilding, axe wielding, and making terrified monks rethink their life choices. Let's start with their craftsmanship. These weren't just warriors, they were artisans with a flair for wood, metal, and intimidation. Viking blacksmiths forged swords so sharp they could slice through chainmail and egos. Their jewelry was intricate, their tools efficient, and their helmets, contrary to popular myth, did not have horns, unless they were attending a particularly festive raid. They carved runes into everything: weapons, stones, spoons, goats, probably. It was part art, part magic, part don't touch my stuff. But the real showstoppers were their ships. Viking longships were the Ferraris of the medieval world, sleek, fast, and capable of parallel parking in a fjord. Built with overlapping planks in a technique called clinker construction. These vessels were strong yet flexible, able to handle stormy seas and shallow rivers with equal ease. They had symmetrical bows and sterns, meaning they could reverse without turning around, perfect for quick getaways or dramatic entrances. Some ships had up to 60 rowers, all synchronized like a very angry ballet troupe. Navigation: no compasses, no GPS, just sunstones, stars, and sheer Viking stubbornness. They used coastal landmarks, celestial bodies, and occasionally a very judgmental raven to find their way. It was part science, part sorcery, and entirely impressive. And then there were their fighting skills. Vikings didn't just swing swords. They choreographed chaos. They trained from youth, practiced with wooden weapons, and believed that dying gloriously in battle was the best retirement plan. Their tactics were brutal but effective. Shield walls, ambushes, and the occasional berserker who fought like he'd just been told to nips were outlawed. They didn't wear heavy armor. Mobility was key. A Viking in battle was fast, furious, and frighteningly efficient. One moment, you're enjoying a quiet morning in your village. The next, you're watching a man in a wolf pelt juggle axes while shouting about Valhalla. But as the raids continued and the longships kept appearing like bad omens with sails, the locals began to adapt. Which brings us to resistance and retaliation. Local lords organizing defenses. The age of terrified monks was about to meet the age of mildly prepared nobles. After years of watching their villages get flambéed by men in fur yelling about Odin, the local lords finally decided, enough is enough. Let's do something vaguely defensive. Thus began the era of strategic panic. These weren't exactly military masterminds. Most of them had spent their lives arguing about sheep taxes and whose moat was muddier. But now, armed with a sense of urgency and a suspiciously vague battle plan, they began organizing defenses. It was like watching a group of squirrels try to build a fortress out of acorns. First came the militia recruitment. Peasants were handed pitchforks, told to look intimidating, and given motivational speeches like, "Try not to die." One lord insisted on training his men by having them chase chickens. Another held a sword upside down for 3 days before someone corrected him. A third knight tried to ride a cow into battle. The cow refused. Fortifications were upgraded, or at least enthusiastically patched. Wooden palisades were reinforced with barrels, laundry, and one very confused monk. Ditches were dug, then immediately filled in by someone who thought they were crop rows. One castle added a second gate, just in case, which led directly into a swamp. It was not helpful. Strategy meetings were held in candlelit halls, where nobles debated things like, should we yell louder? And, can we bribe them with cheese? Maps were drawn with crayons. One lord proposed building a giant scarecrow, shaped like Thor, to confuse the raiders. Another suggested painting angry faces on sheep. The sheep were not consulted. Messengers were dispatched to neighboring villages with warnings like, Vikings might come again. Maybe, possibly, soon-ish. These messages were often delivered by children on donkeys, who got distracted by berries and forgot the details. One village received a note that simply said, "Duck." They did. It didn't help. Despite the chaos, a sense of determined desperation took hold. The nobles weren't ready, but they were trying, and that was new. They began stockpiling weapons, organizing watch rotations, and assigning roles like official screamer and guy who rings the bell when things look bad. And then someone had a brilliant idea. If they couldn't stop the Vikings, maybe they could see them coming. Thus began the era of building signal towers and early warning systems. Because nothing says, "We're serious now," like a flaming barrel on a hilltop. It was the medieval version of a group text light a fire. Panic spreads, everyone grabs a pitchfork and forgets how doors work. Villagers began erecting watchtowers on every hill, mound, and suspiciously tall pile of turnips. These towers weren't elegant. They were functional panic sticks, manned by sleep-deprived peasants with excellent lung capacity and a deep mistrust of sails. The system was simple: see a longship, light a barrel, scream. Hope someone downstream has better aim than you. Some towers used smoke signals, others used bells, and one particularly ambitious village tried trained pigeons. The pigeons defected to the Vikings. Another settlement used horns, which were blown so often that the local goats developed PTSD and refused to graze near brass. Flaming barrels became the gold standard. They were dramatic, visible, and occasionally exploded, adding flair to the warning and singeing the eyebrows of the poor soul assigned to light them. One man became a local legend after lighting 3 barrels, falling off the tower, and still managing to shout, "Vikings!" before landing in a haystack. He was promoted to Chief Screamer. Villagers coordinated their towers like a chain of paranoia. One fire led to another, until the entire countryside looked like it was hosting a very confused festival. Farmers dropped hoes, monks dropped prayers, and children dropped whatever they were chewing on to run for the nearest barrel. Proof cellar. But the towers weren't just for warnings. They were for revenge planning. Because after years of being the Viking pie-eater, some lords decided it was time to swing back. Which brings us to retaliatory attacks against Viking settlements. Because nothing says, "We've learned something." Like showing up at their party with your own flaming barrel. It started small. A few disgruntled nobles, tired of watching their turnips get torched and their cousins get abducted, decided to take the fight to the source. They gathered their bravest warriors, their sturdiest boats, and one guy who insisted on bringing his emotional support goose. The plan: sail north, find a Viking settlement, and politely return the favor. With fire. The first retaliatory raid was enthusiastic. They landed on a beach in Denmark, shouted something vaguely threatening, and immediately got lost in a forest. One knight tried to intimidate a Viking by reciting poetry. The Viking responded by juggling axes. The knight cried. The goose ran, but they learned. Oh, they learned. Soon, retaliatory raids became a thing. English warbands sailed across the North Sea, armed with swords, shields, and a deep desire for revenge. They targeted Viking outposts, burned longhouses, and stole back whatever hadn't already been turned into soup. One group famously kidnapped a Viking goat and renamed it Justice. These attacks weren't just about vengeance. They were about sending a message. "We can raid too," they said, while accidentally setting their own boat on fire. "We're not afraid," they declared, while hiding behind barrels labeled, "Definitely not cowards." One lord even commissioned a banner that read, "No more raids," and promptly lost it in a windstorm. The Vikings, to their credit, were surprised. They hadn't expected their favorite victims to suddenly grow a spine and a fleet. Some settlements beefed up defenses. Others relocated entirely. One Viking chieftain reportedly said, "I miss the days when monks just screamed and dropped their goblets." And while the retaliatory raids weren't always successful, sometimes they attacked the wrong village, sometimes they forgot to bring food, they marked a turning point. The fear began to shift. The balance began to wobble. The goose began to bite. It wasn't a tidal wave of resistance. It wasn't a heroic montage. It was the slow pushback that eventually came. A creeping tide of defiance, built on burnt turnips, stolen goats, and the stubborn refusal to be raided politely ever again. The survivors had had enough. Enough of watching their villages turned into Viking theme parks. Enough of seeing their prized cheese wheels repurposed as Viking helmets. Enough of waking up to find their cousin missing and their goat wearing a crown. The pushback didn't come with fanfare. It came with gritted teeth, bad plans, and a lot of yelling. Villages began to unite. Not because they liked each other, but because they disliked being pillaged even more. Lords who previously argued over who had the fanciest moat now shared battle strategies and soup recipes. Peasants trained with pitchforks. Monks sharpened their Latin insults, and one child invented a war dance called the Angry Turnip. The resistance was messy. One group tried to ambush a Viking camp by hiding in haystacks. They sneezed. Another built a trap involving barrels, bees, and a goat named Vengeance. It worked, sort of. The goat escaped and became a local legend. A bard wrote a song about it. It had 3 verses and a scream. Retaliation became routine. Villagers would sneak into Viking settlements, steal back their spoons, and leave behind passive, aggressive notes like, "Nice long ship. Shame if something happened to it." One noble tried psychological warfare by sending a Viking chieftain a basket of burnt bread labeled, "Our feelings." The chieftain cried. It was unclear why. The pushback wasn't just physical. It was emotional warfare. Villagers began spreading rumors that Odin preferred turnips over gold. That Thor's hammer was actually a repurposed cooking pot. That Loki had once lost a game of chess to a chicken. The Vikings were confused. The chicken was smug, and slowly, the raids became harder. The longships met resistance. The loot was less shiny. The goats were more aggressive. One Viking returned from a raid with a black eye, and a poem written by a monk titled, "You Deserved It." It rhymed. It hurt. The tide had turned, not with glory, but with grime, grief, and goat-fueled vengeance. For those who lived through it, a Viking raid was not a romantic story. It was blood, fire, loss, and fear etched into memory forever. We've tried to stay true to the spirit of history. But hey, sometimes a goat steals the narrative. If we got a rune wrong or exaggerated a spoon duel, blame Loki. Or the turnips. You've reached the end of the saga! If you enjoyed this chaotic blend of history and humor, subscribe, comment, and tell us which part made you laugh, cry, or question your relationship with goats. And if you were listening to this to help you sleep, close your eyes, dream of longships sailing away, and may your turnips remain unburnt. Good night, brave sleeper.